Hello and welcome, Established Titles, to the channel. Thank you, Established Titles, for sponsoring this video. Established Titles is a fun and novel way to preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland while helping global reforestation efforts. It's a project based on historic British customs, where landowners are referred to as lairds or lords and ladies in English. Title packs give you at least 1 square foot of dedicated land on a private estate in Edelston, Scotland, and an official certificate with a crest. Your certificate features a unique plot number with which you can see the exact location of your land. We plant a tree with every order and work with global charities One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to support global reforestation efforts. You can also officially change your name to Lord or Lady once you get this and get it on your credit card, plane tickets, and etc. You can even get it on a dating profile. It makes a great last-minute gift. With the holidays coming up, there's even couple packs that come with adjoining plots of land. The first 200 people purchasing a title pack using my link will effectively be next to my plot, within a few minutes of walking distance. Who knows, maybe we can build our little mystery kingdom. Remember, the holidays are coming, and you might need that last-minute gift. Established Titles is actually running a massive Black Friday sale. Plus, if you use my code nerdSlayerG, you get an additional 10% off. Go to establishedtitles.com/nerdslayerG to get your gifts now and help support the channel. Thank you again to Established Titles for sponsoring this video. Or in other words, thanks for sponsoring this video. That was my best Scottish Gaelic, in honor of my heritage and in the sponsor. Thank you, detectives, and let's get back to the video. Every now and then, detectives encounter a game or project that feels like it was tragic in a sense, destined for an ill-fated future. Sometimes it's not even the projects or games that are outright bad either. In fact, sometimes it's the one that people or players of the game can't deny the quality of it. Maybe it's one big mistake, a collection of them, or a risk taken early on in development. Many things can affect a video game's development negatively, and most games on this series are going to have a slew of those things affecting the game throughout development and post-launch. That's what this series does after all. We take a look at the largest contributing reasons for a game's demise, in this case, Spiral Knights, developed by 3 Rings Design and published by Sega back in April of 2011, and build a timeline of evidence throughout the video to support the case. Finalizing it all with a final deduction near the end of the video that takes all of the aforementioned clues and evidence and deduces the case. Let's get into the next case, detectives. We're taking a step back into the world of browser games for a bit. In other words, home. The story of Spiral Knights, the cooperative online action-adventure game, begins back with the origins of the company behind it. 3 Rings Design formed back in March of 2001 and dubbed such due to the fondness for Tolkien. 3 Rings Design was set to be an online video game developer founded by Daniel James and Michael Bain. The company would start with a browser-based Java title, Yo Ho Ho Puzzle Pirates, described as a skill-based, massively multiplayer online game. Spoiler, it wasn't massive, but it was online, and it was online simultaneously with other players back in 2003. This would be one of their most successful titles, running for over 10 years and likely giving them the success that they needed to launch into their next slew of games. 3 Rings Design would launch a slew of games from 2006 through 2008, such as Bang Howdy, World, and Corpsecraft, which were all playable on browsers and mobile devices. This established the studio as a journeyman of free-to-play mobile and browser games in the industry, because while they didn't have massive successful titles yet, the success was there enough to warrant more development. Like any budding video game developer not directly attached to a publisher or a large source of funding, 3 Rings Design had to grind their way to the top to get a proper contract or notice for one to make a AAA level game. TRD would finally get that call to the big leagues, March 2011, when Sega would announce a new multiplayer online action-adventure game dubbed Spiral Knights. It was set to be described as a console-style adventure in a free-to-play persistent world. While the announcement came in 2011, it reportedly had been working on the game since 2007. More details would drop concerning Spiral Knights later that same month, in March 2011, when Rock Paper Shotgun got a chance to play the game. Their thoughts were, in short, it's a perfectly ordinary Java-powered ultralight RPG executed with plenty of heart and class. Your new character first crash lands in Spiral Island in an escape pod, and the image you see above is the first camp you reach, where some of your people have dragged those escape pods together for shelter. RPS was complimentary of the game, enjoying their testing time and expressing interest in testing the game out upon launch. Spiral Knights was now being dubbed a free-to-play hack-and-slash MMOG, or a massive multiplayer online game. This implies that the game is massive in some way, which I find to be a confusing message, because the trailer footage shown only seemingly was from groups of 4 players at the time. This seemed to be a clear example of Spiral Knights having a bit of divided game design and market focus, or perhaps just not fully understanding the market. Now, for some people watching, you might question why. Why does 3 Rings Design or reporters falsely advertising the game as a massive multiplayer even matter? Well, because the game wasn't massive. It was a cooperative action-adventure game, which was distinctively different for a number of reasons. In an interview on Segabit's lead designer Nick Popovich would state that Dragon Quest was a visual inspiration for the game, and that they were dubbing Phantasy Star Online as a title that heavily influenced Spiral Knights. According to Popovich, PSO was one of his favorite games. Popovich would even state, it was offering an MMO experience with real-time combat on a 28.8 kbps modem back in 1999. Why is it that in 2011 with a broadband connection, that most of my options for MMOs feature slow, simulated, and stat-driven combat? Now, I think this is an interesting question and one that I actually talk a lot about, which is that why are we still relying on basically the same styles of combat versus like maybe innovating a little bit? Except unfortunately detectives, based on my 20+ year tenure in this particular field of online gaming and massive online gaming, including having no life and playing for thousands of hours, that's not correct. I've done a very complimentary Death of the Game video on Phantasy Star already, because it's actually one of my favorite games too. I recommend you watch that before this video. It's just worrying when the lead designer on Spiral Knights seemed to not understand PSO, a game that they were inspired by, very well. For starters, he called the game an MMO. It wasn't, and Yuji Naka and the team never called it that. In fact, Yuji Naka, as stated in my video, specifically urged against making an MMO due to time and budget constraints. Instead, he made this sort of hybrid online server-based game dubbed Phantasy Star Online, capable of playing globally on a modem connection with the ability to use programmable text commands for different languages and culture conversations and interactions. PSO wasn't massive. It didn't try to be, really, in any way. It didn't even advertise as being massive. That's just another example of kind of ethnocentrism at play here, where people from a prominent culture seem to think that everything in the world kind of works the same way with the same cultural lens. What makes PSO so inspirational was that it wasn't an MMO, and yet they were able to essentially become global all the same. It was a stroke of genius that helped forge the very online RPG market today, which more so consists of these PSO-like titles, or as Yuji Naka dubbed them, online RPGs. The idea that some devs have is that basically the hub zone constitutes being an MMO, but what world only constitutes its constituents to access the rest of it, and only for people groups? Well, no world. Those players standing in the hub zone don't really affect you, because you don't have to interact with them. In fact, you can use your own friends instead because it's a co-op game. And even then, only 3 other players can have an actual impact on you. Spiral Knights being sold as a PSO-inspired MMOG felt like an oxymoron to me, and showcases both more instances of Western developers misunderstanding Eastern developers and their markets, and developers in general apparent lack of MMO knowledge. Hopefully this wasn't represented in the game's design either, but unfortunately, it probably is. Building a game for a massive audience brings with it different expectations. For starters, large raids and open world-based content, which doesn't seem to match the dungeon-focused footage shown of Spiral Knights so far. Expectations that were unnecessary to place in your game, when PSO and Diablo exist in their own genres and have plenty to offer you for inspiration. But it's not completely surprising that the 3 Rings design team was missing the mark on this point before launch. When we take a look at the game credits, it was only being developed with 27 developers, something never shown to be possible to push out an MMO-level title. But if they were indeed making a cooperative action-adventure, perhaps that was enough with some proper guidance. Issue being, the lead designer, who we already highlighted, was kind of ignorant, and had no previous game credits. Note, Moby Games is not always accurate, but the idea here is that not a single one of the developers had MMO or even ORPG development experience, which is a worrying sight right before, during, or after launch. And also Moby Games, much like Metacritic and Steam charts, is essentially the best data that we have. Sega announced Spiral Knights' official launch April 4th, 2011. Spiral Knights was a completely free-to-play title that allowed you and up to 3 other friends to team up and adventure through to the core of the Clockworks. Spiral Knights would launch on PC or really any platform capable of Java, such as Linux, Mac, or even Windows-capable devices. Spiral Knights was essentially a browser-capable game released in 2011, which was quite novel and unique. But sometimes something being novel or unique isn't always the best thing. Being a browser game meant that there could be some potential downsides, but considering one of the most successful virtual worlds ever, RuneScape is a browser-based game, and there's more examples, I'm inclined to say that it wasn't the biggest issue. The strength is it made Spiral Knights virtually playable anywhere. I quite enjoy browser games myself, having grown up on the internet as the internet grew up. Spiral Knights offers far more fast-paced and responsive gameplay for a browser game, an online browser game, than I've ever played. Well, besides the whole legs go a different direction thing while I look a different way animation. I can't deny I hate that. But besides that, speaking of the controls in Spiral Knights, you could use WASD or mouse for movement options, which made it easier to play. Spiral Knights was a top-down third-person action-adventure styled akin to Legend of Zelda and Four Swords Adventure. Where Spiral Knights breaks the mold a bit, and perhaps in some questionable ways, is regarding the way combat and gearing is handled. There aren't levels in Spiral Knights, instead it's based on items and what you're wearing, like armor and weapons. The armor in Spiral Knights is akin to many other top-down action games, where each armor provides basic values and then unique abilities based on the type. It's rather limited though, such as only really affecting the damage types, not movement or the class in any meaningful way. Weapons, you have two major options, not counting bombs, which are on a cooldown but can be thrown to explode mass amounts of enemies. There's swords and guns, specifically handguns. Swords allow for more melee combat, a regular and a charge attack, as well as unique abilities based on the type of sword that you have. Same applies for handguns, but these are again, incredibly limited gameplay options according to players and critics alike, due to only servicing basically two weapon styles, without much variety to them. Three Rings could have put more time in to bring in more weapons, but launching out of the gate with two weapons, I'm just gonna say, seems kind of ludicrous. When you're attracting an MMO audience or an online RPG audience who at the very least is used to like 4 options. Another example of not understanding the market. Speaking of critic impressions, according to the aggregate review website Metacritic, Spiral Knights would score a 64 out of 100, but only be covered by a handful of critics. PC Gamer would give the game a not very impressive 51 out of 100, primarily because the game's near radioactive monetization style. The boss level is next. We huddle for a moment and form a plan. I hit the down switch, it doesn't work, because I've run out of my daily allotment of energy points. Can buy either more to continue, or come back 24 hours later. And it was all going so well. Up until the monetization reared its ugly head, PC Gamer was enjoying their experience, so the review was more concerning about the monetization than the gameplay itself. This biting criticism rang true for many other players who tried Spiral Knights out as well. Feeling like you're getting nickel and dimed throughout the entire process of trying to play an online RPG is both exhausting and a complete turnoff for players. It's one thing to pay for enjoyment, that's normal, but to consistently have to pay every step of the way or fear that you're going to be left behind and not play with your friends anymore is both wrong and not really that effective. Why wrong, you say? I don't really interject my opinion much into these videos, right? But, well, because the kind of formula applies when you're playing a mobile game, the kinds of games that Three Rings design had made. In a mobile game, you don't want players to spend too much time in the game because there's not enough content and not much world to begin with, designing the game mechanically as well so as to incentivize people paying to progress. But in an online RPG like Spiral Knights trying to be inspired by Phantasy Star Online, essentially the godfather of the industry, you want your players in the world to be there as long as possible, if you're trying to make it persistent especially, whether that's sitting in a town or adventuring. Limiting players in what they can do in their time online in another world is always going to be a recipe for disaster. I mean, it doesn't even work in our world, unless you can come up with a true and believable lore reasons like dragon flies by and you have to hide or whatever else. It just screams of a misunderstanding of the game's inspiration, which we sort of pointed out already, and misunderstanding of the market that they were targeting, which seemed to be the online RPG market, or they were saying the MMO market. PSO made money from selling new versions of the game, and that was it. They didn't have microtransactions, literally. MMOs make money by enticing players to subscribe monthly usually, so the amount that they play is irrelevant, or to play free to play and try to maximize how much time these players are playing. Why? Because then you can find more ways to monetize the game. It's like someone sitting inside of a mall, but the mall is devoid of anything fun or enjoyable or even a place to sit. You've never heard of that, because the point of the shopping center is to be fun, enticing, and even a hangout place to encourage more commerce. Whatever path you choose to monetize your game with, it has to be built into your game's design, and the energy system seemed to be built into Spiral Knights', which was a massive turnoff for players. Pushing forward past talks of poor monetization and all, Spiral Knights would have a Steam launch June 16th, 2011, bringing the game up to a new audience. But unfortunately, with the same monetization system in place, a monetization system that once players see what sort of content the game has in store, will feel like it's made to keep them from playing too much content because there just wasn't enough. And well, there wasn't. The entire premise of Spiral Knights revolves around players grouping up in Haven, the city, and then launching into the Clockwork, aka the dungeons. But these are essentially repeatable dungeons, which is great and fun when they are great and fun, but when that fun wears off, and it wears off fast, it's why other games rely on different modes and difficulties to add more novelty. Spiral Knights would have this, but the other options are limited by nature, and it would take them time to get these features, whether you could use special tokens or have long time gates. This might not sound weird compared to other MMOs because people are going to talk about time gates and having to do weeklies and so on and so forth, but in Spiral Knights these tunnels were basically the world. It's not like you can really go anywhere else, right? Besides the city. And even though there's some hard difficulty modes in Spiral Knights, they're incredibly limited for launch compared to any other MMO or even an ORPG. There's no worries there yet though. There's still time to add more content given the game is a free-to-play live game. PSO, who didn't have the same luxury, had to reissue discs to issue updates. They still managed to put out some serious content within the first 3 years of the game. If Spiral Knights could follow suit with changes to the energy system and this content dedication, they could pull themselves out of a hole. There was a key difference between the two, however, well, besides the ones we've already outlined. Spiral Knights was free-to-play, and PSO was a buy-to-play title, which means that Spiral Knights being reliant on expanding content and starting with a deficit in that respect was an incredibly negative aspect because of this difference. Because if TRD was hoping to bring in more content after making money, well, it's gonna be hard to even get there. Spiral Knights would share some level of success though, reaching 3 million players by July 6, 2011. But in typical online games fashion, what players constitute isn't really mentioned. So it could theoretically be referring to a person who just created an account, someone who played for a single second or a minute. It paints a bit of a warped narrative though, which is why I don't really like when developers and companies do this. This becomes more clear as the dust settles a bit, aka after a few months pass and suddenly that large number you used to impress people is more like a few thousand players, which is a massive drop. That's because in online gaming, retention is the most important thing. It's one thing to have people playing for a short time, but when your monetization and game style are basically trying not to get players to play for long periods of time, well, you can see the problem. Spiral Knights was a pioneer in being one of the first free-to-play titles on Steam though, and it was an early title to feature Steam trading, which would give it a slight boost in population. The same year their most ambitious title launched, Spiral Knights developer Three Ring Design would be gobbled up completely by Sega. Reports from both sides were positive concerning the news as well. But to be fair, these are both pretty generic responses and give us no details about the deal, like why or what the ultimate goal even is. They just briefly mention that in the report that TRD will continue to work on another massively multiplayer online game, which I'm assuming isn't going to actually be massive and would end up being Doctor Who. Spiral Knights would get frequent updates, the year it launched well into the next year. However, larger content updates that the game needed were more infrequent. Updates up until that point had been mostly focused around balancing bugs and quality of life stuff, all needed, but not really addressing the lack of content that every theme park style game essentially suffers from. And that's because the content expires very easily. Sure, things like achievements were added, but nearly every ORPG already had those. It was an industry standard. 2 new bosses would be added, a new undead level series, the PvP mode. These were good additions, but again were more so bringing the game into alignment with its competitors and not further elevating it. I mean, sure, PSO didn't launch with PvP, but that was the turn of the century, my guys. And Spiral Knights didn't get a full mission questing system until February 2012 either, which seemed comparable to Star Wars Galaxies, which came out in 2003. The mission system itself has some cool bells and whistles, but largely is the same sort of rinse and repeat quest system most players are familiar with by 2012. That same month, TRD would release a paid expansion mission too, which just seemed tone deaf to me given the game didn't even have large enough content for free yet. By May of 2012, you have Spiral Knights already reusing skins, missions, and more. Where was all the content? By the summer of the same year, Spiral Knights would be putting out some high-quality updates including new higher difficulty missions, called Danger Missions, adding a harder difficulty to a game a year after it launches. They would end 2012 off on a positive trend though, as they would introduce a new guild hall system in the game for player guilds. I find these sorts of systems, again, good ideas, but not necessary given the style of game being created and also, again, on my previous point, feel a bit late. There's very little need past a point to have cooperation in Spiral Knights, especially to the level and scale of a guild anyway. Spiral Knights would have a slew of updates, so it's not like the game wasn't getting updated, but perhaps having focus all over the place and not enough content is just giving the game too many issues. The much needed energy revamp concerning Spiral Knights' monetization wouldn't come until July 2013, a year and a few months after the game's launch. This was very likely the single largest contributing factor to players not enjoying the game. Seeing it addressed so late was just a bummer. TRD would add new prestige missions or missions only available for limited times that would offer great rewards, in the form of Shroud of Apocrypha. Well, actually just one. Yes, literally one repeatable mission. I have to highlight how crazy this is in the big scheme of things. Even if this is the greatest repeatable quest ever, hyping up and building your audience anticipation for one piece of content? Really? For historical reference, titles like Asheron's Call had put out monthly updates for new content in the way of story and quests for over 2 years straight. That was in the early 2000s. Nick Popovich, the lead designer on Spiral Knights, would leave rather abruptly, citing chasing opportunities in January of 2014. leaving Spiral Knights without their original project lead for the first time. Whether or not Nick was part of the problem by this point of the process was beside the point. Perhaps Nick didn't really want to leave, or maybe they just felt it wasn't a relationship they were going to reconcile following Spiral Knights' kind of failure. Whatever the reasons for him departing are, might remain a mystery, but one thing's for sure is perhaps Nick wasn't the best leader for Spiral Knights given the type of game approach that it tried to reach. By July of 2014, 3 years after the game's launch, players were outraged about accusations of more reskin content and skins. This was an obvious sign to the educated player base that content would only continue to slow for Spiral Knights going into 2014 and on. Because of this, the population would only continue to drop for the online action-adventure game. From this point on, you barely see any significant updates, as the Spiral Knights already slows down heavily. The game wouldn't see another serious mission update until February of 2015 either. At this point, the writing has all been on the wall. As the population continues to shrink up for Spiral Knights, when the content starts to slow to a crawl, it's quite clear that resources are being shifted elsewhere to either a new project, or they might shift the game to a maintenance mode, which means it's not going to get any new content, or worse, shut it down. Speaking of shutdown, Three Rings Design would be shut down March 6, 2016. Sega would cite a new focus on internally developed IP-based games, the localization of Japanese mobile games, and other mobile-style games as reasons for it. This seems kind of odd to me though, considering that Three Rings Design is actually a mobile browser designer essentially. But you never really get a proper reason when you see such a layoff, and the reason could be leadership just wanting out, or Sega pulling the plug due to possible negative reasons. Whatever those reasons are, ultimately, besides what's given, we won't really know and we'll have to form kind of our own conclusions. At the very least, Spiral Knights or Puzzle Pirates wouldn't be shut down yet, with some key developers shifting to Grey Havens, a company erected to operate on a maintenance mode budget to keep the title afloat. Well, I actually think that kind of gives us a bit of a clue of why Sega did what they did though, right? Seems like they were cutting their losses at that point. The last Steam update for Spiral Knights would come December 14th, 2018. 7 years after the game launched. According to my sources though, there were leaks on a community Discord concerning possible Tier 4 expansion, but there has been no news since. As is typical with dying online RPGs or MMOs, the community is just not keen to let the game die, as they have a personally developed interest in the game, whether this be through community server efforts, community patches, and mods. In the case of Spiral Knights, one of their users designed a launcher that gave Spiral Knights effectively a community patch, fixing many of the bugs and issues of the game in its interface. It made the game smoother, and was being offered for free, as it should be from a member of the community. According to this community member Lucas Allegri though, they were sent to DMCA to stop advertising their launcher. Anytime you see developers just negatively affecting community efforts to try and essentially fix their broken game, effectively in lieu of the developers, it's always a horrible sign. While having a stance against mods or third-party add-ons is not necessarily unfair, it's not really that common in ORPGs or MMORPGs, and is particularly frowned upon by these players. It also seems to embody that saying of, to cut off your nose in spite of your face. They're trying to help after all. At least just steal their ideas and thank them for the free labor? Yeesh. It also, in my opinion, made possible community efforts to preserve the game seem dubious at best. That being said, there is a strong community trying to keep excitement about the game circulating, as well as attracting new members to the game, or at very least, educating the audiences that were interested in it. The Arcade is a Discord group that is interested in keeping excitement about the game alive, since the devs have sort of failed to do that. Whether Spiral Knights had a popular, well-known tenure or not doesn't matter. It lasted for over a decade. So regardless of someone else's thoughts about the game, or mine for example, other players found the game enjoyable, and want to remember the memories that they created in Spiral Knights. It's always sad when a world shuts down after all, because it's like a second home for many people, which encapsulates communities like the Arcade. By 2022, there's next to no information about Spiral Knights, and its future past maintenance mode, which is safe to say that the game should be shutting down at any point. With their parent company essentially just a holding company at this point, there's no real future for the game anymore. That means that we have reached the end of our timeline. And if you're hearing that music, that's Tom's way of signaling that it's time to put this case to bad detectives. We've gathered more than enough clues at this point to impress even Steve. Inexperienced development team. Sold as an MMO with a max of only 4 players. Energy system business model was horrendous. Didn't learn from their inspirations. Subpar to industry standard features. Limited content released. An identity crisis of design. The original parent company was shut down. Browser games might be a bit of a dying art with how accessible video games have become on a number of platforms, including mobile devices, and how much they keep continuing to push the envelope there. But while Spiral Knights was technically a browser game, in the end faced quite a normal online RPG issue that proved to be far more potent than it could handle. Spiral Knights might have lasted quite a long time for a lesser-known title that had a very short time in the sun, but it's always going to be sad that we kind of never got to see the game at its full potential. Or maybe we did, and that was their best effort for the time. There isn't always some big message that needs to be told in a video after all, even a death of a game video. As for you detectives, thanks for watching this video and your continued support.